So you've spent around 40 years studying grasses and geysers and what you've called becoming a world expert on goose poop. If a friend had no idea what all of that meant, all of what you do, how would you explain it in 1 to 2 sentences?
Thanks for that great question, Ari. What I would say is grass is the foundation of the civilization that we live in today. Because beer is made from grass, all of the cereal you eat is a grass, your lawns are grass. World Cup has to play on live grass. So, what I do is I am a grass scientist, and grass itself is eaten by an awful lot of animals. So the whole agricultural industry. So that's really what I do is I have looked at the interaction between animals that eat grasses and how the grasses respond. And they are the most interesting plants. They are not as pretty as orchids, but I can tell you they are super cool.
All right. So you grew up to become a field ecologist, and once you had polar bears actually eat your field experiments on the Hudson Bay. Was there a specific moment early on in your career that made you think that this was what you're going to dedicate your life to?
When did I know? So I wanted to be a biologist since I was probably about 9 or 10 in England, living in England, when we had this cool substitute science teacher who took us to the Natural History Museum in London. And I saw all these cool dioramas of like Africa and the savannas. And I thought that is so cool. And I grew up watching David Attenborough, who's now like 100 years old and still making
Yeah.
documentaries about nature, but like he wasn't 100 years old then. That was like decades ago. I was a kid. So I always was really into biology, but I grew up in London, which is a super urban area. So I didn't see that much cool nature except for sparrows and daisies and dandelions. And then when my family emigrated to Canada, um, it was pretty simple. I went to first year university. Everybody wants to go into medical school and be a doctor. I very quickly realized it was not for me because we all have those aspirations because I can't stand the sight of blood. And I took a cool course in first year about flowers and nature. And I was like, I love the professor. I took another course with him in second year. I think you call that, what do you call second year of
Sophomore, typically.
sophomore? I can never remember. Last year I was at Yale and I kept telling them, use the numbers first, second, third, fourth. I can't do the other one. And then in third year, I did another course with the same professor, and he invited me to apply for like this federal government natural sciences undergraduate scholarship. And then he said, do you want to come and be a field assistant for my master's student in the Arctic? And I went and I was like, wow. And I met a lot of people who were doing that kind of science with snow geese and people studying polar bears. And that was when I could see how you could have a career. Because when you're growing up, like what I do, people think, how on earth can you have a job doing what you're doing? If you're interested in biology, like people think, oh, medicine, right? That's the obvious one. And I was like, I can't be a doctor because like I do have to these days, I have to be first aid trained for going on ships in the Arctic. I have a lot of first aid training. And I just say the most important thing is I'm going to call the medics. Like if I have to deal with anything involving blood and an injury. But I am trained. But don't count on me because I will have fainted.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Arctic. What's something that a lot of people believe about the Arctic, how it works, what lives there, how fragile it is, etc., that's just not true?
So I think for most Canadians live within 100 miles of the Canada-US border. It is known until quite recently as the longest undefended border in the world. Because Canada, US, part of the same North American continent. So most Canadians never get to the Arctic. And I think the thing that most Canadians, or most people, certainly Canada and many people in the States, think is that they will never be able to get to the Arctic, that it's too expensive and far away. And I will say that is absolutely not true. You, there are ways to get to the Arctic and see the tundra. That was probably a weird answer. You probably didn't expect that
I mean,
answer.
it's an interesting answer. So you've studied, you mentioned snow geese. You've studied how grazers like snow geese, they transform entire landscapes. Can you give me a specific example of how a single herbivore population can reshape an ecosystem?
Right. So snow geese are just how can a herbivore population reshape an entire ecosystem? Right now, this is an issue in Africa because it turns out that the rhino population is apparently out of control in some national park. So grazing animals, when there are enough of them, they have to eat something, and because they eat plants, they have to eat a lot of plants to be able to meet their protein requirement. So, if you're like if you're in a human, it's really easy. You just eat some chicken. It's going to give you a big punch of protein. If you're a vegan, you have to be really careful about getting enough high protein, like beans and things like that, right? So, herbivores, grazing animals, whether it's geese or sheep or rabbits, or rhinoceri or giraffes have to eat a lot of plant material, which is really low in nitrogen to accumulate enough nitrogen to build muscles. So if you are literally being like a lawnmower, it doesn't take long for a lot of herbivores grazing to completely transform a habitat. So goats can get into an area and they'll just like eat everything. And before you know it, all the vegetation has died. And if it's North Africa, there's more desert. They just keep eating. They just keep eating and pooping, eating and pooping. That's what they do all day.
Yeah, so in I was reading one of your articles and part of your website. So invasive species like the Japanese beetle or the red lily beetle, they seem very small, but you've argued that they can disrupt entire ecosystems. Can you give me a number of from 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how harmful that these animals are?
So I don't think it's more difficult for insects to have that punch that animals with fur or feathers. So we think of vertebrate herbivores. I just say, think of the ones with fur and feathers or like wool and feathers. But then you have insects, which have more legs and are tinier. Usually, there's got to be a lot of them, like a plague of locusts or something, right? And they actually are years where there are plagues of locusts and they'll just come in and just like wipe out entire fields of crops, right? So that can happen. The insects that I was mentioning are like they are introduced from other countries, the red lily beetle, which is a very specific, it's an insect that is a specialist. So it needs to eat like lilies. And then there's like the beautiful Japanese beetle. And I'm just going to say, I'm not an entomologist. I am not an insect specialist. So if I'm going to study bugs, and apparently we're not supposed to say bugs, we're supposed to say insects. I have to study insects that I can identify because I'm not really someone that gets into microscopes for insect identification. Like I can identify sheep and elephants, the big things. So those are two um, insects that have really invaded gardens. So I'm going to ask you, have you seen Japanese beetles in the local gardens? Because I can promise you
I have.
they're there.
Yep, I've seen them before.
They're very pretty, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Um, yeah, I agree. I mean, you just
But
told
they
me
can
how.
so they can build up. So the thing about those and Japanese beetle is what we call a generalist herbivore. So it doesn't concentrate on one species. So they'll just come in and like wipe out roses. which they and then I go around picking them all off because you don't want to use insecticides, which could harm our lovely robins that are nesting in the neighbor's porch. But the lilies are the lily beetles are worrying because we have in where you live in New Jersey and where I live, we've got native indigenous lily species like Michigan lily, which are beautiful and they're like wildflowers. And the problem is that those lily beetles don't just eat the garden ones, they eat everything.
Yeah, so could you give me like a quick example of one thing that's happening in ecology that nobody's talking about right now that you think people ought to be?
One thing happening in ecology that people should be talking about. I did read, so this is something I teach in my classes. It's about climate change impacts. Um, and it has to do with latitudinal gradients, right? So, like at the equator, there's like tropical rainforest because it's really wet and really warm. So, it's this really great environment for lots of species to grow. And as you go further north or south to the North Pole or the South Pole, you see shorter and shorter species and fewer species. It's cold desert, polar desert, and there's not much there. So if you look at the same latitude in North America, do you know trillium, white trillium? Do you know that plant? That's our provincial flower, and it grows where you are. You can actually go to above the Arctic Circle in northern Norway in the city of Tromsø, and you can see in the Botanic Garden there trillium growing. Now that's the same latitude as like Nunavut, like Arctic Canada. You will never see our provincial flower growing in the Arctic. It's just too cold and too harsh. How can that plant be growing in the Arctic Circle, above the Arctic Circle in Norway? Well, it has to do with something called the Gulf Stream, which is a warm water current that is taking warm water from the Gulf all the way across to warm up Europe and Ireland.
Yeah.
And climate change modeling for like 20, 25 years has said that as the world warms, the Gulf Stream current is likely to turn off. And if it does, it will put Europe, Northern Europe, and Iceland and all those places which have nice green grass into the deep freeze. And there was an article, I came across it in the Guardian newspaper the other day saying the climate modelers, the people that model climate change projections, are saying that AMOC, as it's called, that there's like a technical name for it, like El Nino and El Nino and stuff, is yeah, it may it seems more and more likely. They were speculating about 15, 20 years ago that it could switch off if climate change continued as was being observed. And it looks like it's really going to turn off. And believe me, if it switches off, Trillium grandiflorum, our white trillium that you know from New Jersey, will no longer be living in Arctic Norway because it will be just like the Arctic here. And
Yeah.
those countries, Sweden, Scandinavia, Scotland, they are not prepared for how cold it gets.
Yeah. So, on a 1 to 5 scale, 5 being the most, how urgent do you think the state of the Arctic and subarctic ecosystems are right now? We don't have too much more time, but just like I have like one or two more
So
questions for you.
it's the canary in a coal mine. The Arctic and the subarctic are the canaries in the coal mine. And the impacts of anthropogenic climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, has been observed there for the past 30 years. And it's just getting worse and worse. Permafrost is melting. It's really bad. It's bad. And well, we're seeing like the tree lines moving north, non-indigenous, non-native species are moving north. Yeah, it's serious.
So, what would you rate it? 5 being the most, 1 being the least? What would you think it
Five,
is? 5.
five. In my
Yeah.
lifetime, I've seen glaciers receding even over the last 10 years in Greenland.
So, who are one or two? I ask this to every interview that I do. Who are one or two scientists I should interview after you, who you think would be good to talk to?
Who to talk to? Do they have to be from the USA?
No, no, no. They can be I have a
In Europe?
professor that I'm going to interview from New
Okay.
Zealand, so they can
Oh,
definitely
nice.
be.
So I'm going to give you one person that's top of mind. His name, he's actually in Utah. He actually lives in Colorado. His name is Fred Provenza. I've just put him in there. He is an emeritus. That means he's retired. He's in his mid 70s. Um, in agriculture and animal behavior. He really influenced my research in the 1980s. He has a brilliant book that came out about 6 years ago, pre-COVID. And he and I have always kept in touch. I would actually, for just one person, because I'm hoping to connect with him, haven't talked with him for about 4 or 5 years. Fred Provenza. He's a cancer survivor. He is a brilliant scientist on diet selection in cows and sheep and how they detect poisonous plants. Because plants fight back.
Yeah.
They're not just going to sit there and be eaten. Like they got poisons. Um, Talk to Fred because he is one of the most influential and inspirational scientists in my career. And if you want one for the United Kingdom, I'm giving you the old guys before they all die. There's lots of young ones. I would say try and connect with John Krebs, Lord Krebs, who is now 80. His father, have you heard of something called the Krebs cycle?
I haven't.
The Krebs cycle,
Yeah,
respiration. His dad got a Nobel Prize for that. But John Krebs is
yeah.
yeah, I'm giving you these old white guys. I
No,
mean,
that's
I know
fine.
a lot of non-old white guys, but you could talk to, but
Right.
these are just two people
Hmm.
who, if you could have a conversation with them, because they're getting
Okay.
on, they are brilliant.
All right. So I have
I'm
one
gonna
more.
put John in there.
Yeah.
And I can connect you to both of them
Okay.
and bully them into speaking to you.
Okay. So I have one more question before I actually have to go very soon. So I ask this again to every scientist. If every teenager on Earth had to hear one sentence from you, what would it be?
You know more than you think you do. Trust yourself.